It is somewhere past midnight in the Laotian jungle, and a North Vietnamese soldier is about to make a mistake he will not live long enough to understand. He moves through the black undergrowth toward what he takes for his own perimeter. He reaches out, finds a shoulder in the dark, and taps it. He says in Vietnamese that it is the other man's turn to pull guard duty. The man he has tapped is not North Vietnamese. He is an American, lying in the silence with a recon team called Lion, a studies and observations group element that has gone to ground for the night deep inside a country the United States swore, in public, it had no soldiers in. For one held breath, nothing moves. Then the night comes apart. Claymores, muzzle flash, men shouting in two languages, and somewhere overhead, the drone of an aircraft the soldier on the ground never knew was listening. By the account the survivors gave afterward, that one wrong touch in the dark is how an entire North Vietnamese unit learned, far too late, that the jungle it owned by daylight belonged to someone else after the sun went down. That moment is the question this story turns on. The North Vietnamese army held the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They had the numbers, the supply, the home ground, and years to learn every ridgeline. So why did their own commanders begin treating the hours of darkness as the most dangerous part of the day, and what did a few hundred American volunteers actually do to earn that fear? If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand the night, you first have to understand the ground, and the strange fact at the center of the whole war. The Ho Chi Minh Trail did most of its work in the dark. It was not one road. It was a breathing network of paths, truck routes, fuel lines, river crossings, and supply depots running south out of North Vietnam through the mountains and rainforest of Laos and Cambodia, feeding men and material into the south. The organization that built and ran, it was called Group 559, formed on the 19th of May, 1959, under an officer named Vo Bam. It began with a couple of transportation battalions and a few thousand men leaning on bicycles. Within a few years, it had grown into tens of thousands of soldiers with motorized transport battalions, engineers, anti-aircraft gunners, and security troops, all dedicated to keeping the river of supply moving. And because American aircraft owned the sky in daylight, the trail learned to move at night. Trucks ran with their headlights hooded or off, drivers feeling their way along routes they had memorized, porters carrying loads on foot and on bicycle frames through the hours when the bombers could not see them. The Americans understood this and tried to answer it. Air Force squadrons flew dedicated night interdiction over the trail, among them the old twin-engine A-26 invaders of the squadron that worked out of Nakhon Phantom in Thailand under the call sign Nimrod, hunting truck traffic in the dark. So the night over the trail was already contested before a single recon team ever crawled into it. What SOG added was a set of human eyes on the ground, inside the enemy's working hours, in the one place the bombers could never reach. The men who did this work operated out of a command with a name built to sound like a filing cabinet, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. Inside the organization, the men called it SOG. It had been created on the 24th of January, 1964, to do the things the United States government could not admit to doing, and its reconnaissance work across the borders ran under code names that change across the years, Shining Brass, and then Prairie Fire in Laos, Daniel Boone, and later Salem House in Cambodia. According to figures later disclosed in the United States Congressional Record, between September of 1965 and April of 1972, SOG ran 1,579 reconnaissance patrols in Laos alone, with hundreds more across Cambodia. The men who crossed that border carried no identification. If they were captured, the official position was that they did not exist. The basic team, sometimes called a recon team and sometimes a spike team, was small. Usually a few Americans, mostly Green Berets, and a larger number of indigenous fighters, very often Montagnards from the mountain tribes, or Chinese Nung mercenaries, men who could read that jungle the way few outsiders ever would. The team leader was called the 1-0, a title earned by experience rather than rank, and SOG's most effective 1-0s were frequently sergeants the conventional promotion system had passed over. The teams went in sterile. They carried Soviet AK-47 rifles, or Swedish K submachine guns, instead of American weapons, wore North Vietnamese web gear, ate Vietnamese food on the trail, and stripped the serial numbers off everything, so that a body left behind would tell the enemy as little as possible about who had been there. They were inserted by helicopter into landing zones 20, 30, sometimes 40 kilometers past the line on the map, and the instant the helicopter lifted away, the team was alone. There was no friendly artillery in range. There were no reinforcements within walking distance. There was a radio, a forward air controller orbiting somewhere above when the schedule allowed, and the team's own ability to stay unseen. Staying unseen meant surviving the night, and the men who lived it have left a clear record of what that was like. Jim Bolin, a Special Forces team leader who went on more than 40 SOG missions and was pulled out under fire for more than 30 of them, described the nights without the gloss that later legend put on them. The team had radio contact with its forward air controller only 2 or 3 times a day, and the evening call mattered most because it pinned down the team's position in case the morning brought only silence on the net. After that last call, the team found what Bolin called a remain overnight position, and his rule for choosing one was grimly practical. Look for a spot in the jungle so miserable that even an animal would not sleep there, somewhere so hard to crawl into that an animal trying to reach you would wake you first. The last thing you wanted was a comfortable place to lie down. Comfort meant it was reachable, and reachable meant dead. A team did not move at night unless it had no other choice, because movement made noise and noise was death. So the men lay in their chosen misery in the dark, weapons pointed outward, Claymores set, listening to a jungle full of people whose whole job was to find them. Here the legend needs correcting, because the most repeated phrase attached to these men is not actually theirs. You will hear it said that the North Vietnamese called the SOG commandos the men with green faces. The phrase is real, and the dread behind it was real, but its clearest document at home is with the Navy SEALs operating in the Rung Sat and the Mekong Delta, where the Viet Cong gave that name to the face-painted raiders who came out of the water at night and put bounties on their heads. It became the title of a well-known novel about the SEALs, and over the decades it drifted across into the wider story of every painted-faced American special unit, SOG included. The painted face was common to all of them. The specific nickname belongs first to the SEALs. What the record actually documents about the North Vietnamese reaction to SOG is more concrete and, frankly, more telling than a nickname. The North Vietnamese answer to SOG was money, medals, and an entire counter-effort built from nothing. SOG itself ran a bounty in the other direction, offering its men around $100 and a stretch of rest and relaxation for a live prisoner snatched off the trail, with watches and cash going to the indigenous troops who pulled it off. The enemy returned the favor. Captured documents and the briefings drawn from them warned SOG men that the North Vietnamese had begun offering rewards, and that Hanoi was awarding a decoration to soldiers who killed the Americans running cross-border recon. They raised dedicated counter-reconnaissance units whose only job was to find and destroy the teams. By the time of the fighting in and around the A Shao Valley, captured enemy documents indicated the North Vietnamese had placed close to a dozen counter-recon companies in that valley alone, reinforcing the landing zone watchers who studied the sky for the helicopters that meant a team was coming. They used trackers who would follow a team's trail just off to the side, within hearing, firing signal shots into the air to herd the Americans toward a blocking force. Later, they fielded sapper-trained hunter-killer teams, and the men in the field came to call the worst of them exactly what they were. The reason the United States needed men crawling through that jungle at all was that everything it had tried from the air had failed to shut the trail down. The bombing had run for years, and under many names, barrel roll over northern Laos, Steel Tiger, and Tiger Hound farther south, and after 1968, the long interdiction campaign called Commando Hunt, all of it aimed at the same web of roads and fords and truck parks. American aircraft put an enormous tonnage of bombs onto the trail, cratering the routes, burning the depots they could find, seeding the passes with electronic sensors that listened for engines in the dark and relayed the sound to aircraft orbiting overhead. The trail absorbed all of it and kept moving. Repair crews filled the craters by hand overnight. Drivers learned which stretches to run and which to wait out. The supply that fed the 1968 Tet Offensive came down infrastructure that years of bombing had not broken. The lesson the planners came to, slowly and against their own instincts, was that they could not destroy what they could not find, and from 20,000 feet, they could not find most of it under that triple canopy. They needed eyes on the ground, inside the enemy's own working hours, close enough to read a unit's strength and put a strike on a target the cameras had missed. That was the job. It was paid for in the dark, 12 men at a time. Getting those 12 men onto the ground and back off, it was its own contest, and the North Vietnamese learned to fight it. The helicopter pilots who flew the insertions were among the best the war produced, and they had learned that altitude was the enemy. High meant visible, and the beat of rotor blades carried for kilometers across still jungle air, giving the trail security forces time to move toward a landing zone rather than away from it. So the pilots came in low, hugging the shape of the ground, dropping into a clearing fast enough that the team had only seconds to clear the skids before the aircraft was climbing away again. The moment it was gone, the team was alone. The enemy's answer was to post landing zone watchers, men whose only job was to study the few clearings a helicopter could use and to report the instant one came in low. A circling aircraft over a particular patch of jungle men a team was about to land, and the ground beneath it was about to become a hunting box. SOG answered the watchers with deception. Helicopters would touch down on empty zones and lift off again, carrying no one. Several ships would insert at the same moment across different clearings, only one of them carrying the real team, forcing the counter-recon force to split itself among the false ones. By the time the enemy had checked the empty zones, the real team was already moving and gone. When even that stopped working in the most heavily watched areas, the teams briefly tried jumping in by parachute from high altitude, a halo insertion to come down far from any clearing the enemy was watching at all. None of it was a permanent solution. Nothing in that jungle was. It bought hours, and hours were often the whole margin between a clean extraction and a team calling its last coordinates into a radio. The counter-recon effort only sharpened with time. The North Vietnamese studied captured SOG equipment to learn how the teams moved and communicated. They used tracker dogs and human trackers who could read the specific signs an experienced jungle fighter left behind, the way a stream bank takes a man's weight differently when he crosses slowly, the particular crush of leaves under a careful boot. They built whole formations dedicated to the single mission of finding and killing recon teams, and by 1969 and into 1970 the teams were being compromised at higher rates than ever, sometimes ambushed on the landing zone before they had taken a dozen steps. A memoir by one SOG veteran, written about exactly that period, describes the enemy fielding special hunter formations and missions that could no longer be completed without heavy contact, until the classic quiet reconnaissance patrol was becoming a thing of the past. What the teams did once they were on the ground was more than watch, and that is part of why the enemy hunted them so hard. By Major Plaster's own accounting of the work, recon men mined the enemy's roads and ambushed his truck convoys, snatched prisoners off the trail, planted the seismic sensors and homing beacons that guided the bombers, performed bomb damage assessments after the B-52 strikes, and tapped the field telephone lines the North Vietnamese ran through the jungle between their command posts. They also ran one of the strangest and cruelest programs of the Secret War, slipping doctored ammunition into the enemy's own supply chain. A sabotage effort the planners called eldest son seeded caches with rifle, machine gun, and mortar rounds that had been rebuilt to detonate when fired, destroying the weapon and the man holding it. The point was not only the handful of casualties it caused. The point was doubt. A North Vietnamese soldier already lying awake in a dark he no longer trusted now had a second thing to fear, the round in his own chamber. That is the layered weight the recon teams put on the men hunting them. Not a body count, which the teams rarely produced, but a steady erosion of the simple confidence an army needs. The confidence that the ground is yours, that your supply is sound, that the dark is safe. Against that, SOG taught craft. The unit ran what the recon men called the 1-0 school, where the trade was passed down by the sergeants who had survived it, and the lessons were built around the assumption that contact was a matter of when rather than whether. Teams measured their movement off the trails in meters rather than kilometers, placing each foot, testing the ground before committing weight. They drilled immediate action responses for the moment a hunt closed in, peeling back through prepared fire, leaving Claymores behind them angled to the trail they had just walked, putting up a wall of noise and steel to buy the seconds it took to break clean and vanish in a different direction than the enemy expected. Above them, when the schedule and the weather allowed, an aircraft the men knew as Moonbeam orbited through the night hours, a flying command post that could raise a team in trouble and start the machinery of an extraction or an airstrike moving in the dark. None of it made the night safe. It made the night survivable for men who did everything right and stayed lucky, and the casualty figures are the measure of how thin that margin ran. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What that adaptation produced by 1968 and into the years after was a contest decided in the dark, and a single mission in the Shao Valley shows the shape of it. Recon Team Python was one of a handful of SOG teams put into the A Shao in February of 1971 to draw North Vietnamese attention during the South Vietnamese push into Laos. The team knew before it ever landed that the valley was thick with the counter-recon units trained specifically to hunt men like them, and that a rich reward waited for whoever could wipe out a team or take one alive. Python set up on high ground as the light failed. The first contact came a few hours after sunset, when the team heard the enemy moving up toward its perimeter through the black. They blew the first Claymores at sounds they could not see, the directional mines shredding the undergrowth and driving the rest back down the slope with a long burst of automatic fire behind them. The startled North Vietnamese managed only a few shots before they pulled away. A couple of hours later came a scatter of mortar rounds, enough to wound 2 of the men, and a call for a medical evacuation that could not be answered because another SOG team somewhere else was already in trouble. So the men of Python patched their own wounds and watched. Far below them on the valley floor, in the dark that was supposed to belong to the enemy, they could see headlights crawling along the trail and flashlights moving on either side of it, the endless stream of men and supplies pushing south as if nothing on a mountain above them mattered. It looked like ordinary traffic. It was not. What the team could not see was that the North Vietnamese had decided the mountain did matter, and were assembling a force of several hundred men, mortars, and recoilless rifles to sweep them off at the following night. The team had become bait that bit back, and the enemy was willing to spend a battalion to be rid of one small element on a ridgeline. That is the arithmetic that ran underneath the whole secret war. A handful of men with a radio could pull hundreds of enemy soldiers out of the supply effort and fix them in place around a single hilltop, and the North Vietnamese paid that price again and again because the alternative, leaving the team free to call on the bombers, was worse. The price the men themselves paid was steeper, and the night of the 18th into the 19th of February, 1968, shows what it cost. With the Tet Offensive underway, and the North Vietnamese using Laos and Cambodia as staging ground, SOG pushed several teams across the border to read enemy strength and judge whether a second wave was coming. One of them was Spike Team Maine, 3 Americans and 9 Nungs, led that day by Staff Sergeant Doug Glover, with Staff Sergeant Fred Zabatoski along as assistant team leader, a job Zabatoski had volunteered for because Glover was his friend. The night before they went in, by Zabatoski's own account, Glover told him he had dreamed he was going to be killed. They inserted east of Adipu, in Laos, and almost at once they were into more enemy than the ground could hide. Over roughly an hour and a half, the forward air controller, circling above, counted more than 20 separate assaults thrown at the small team by what was estimated to be 4 North Vietnamese companies. Zabatoski ran the defense, calling the A-1 Sky Raiders, and so close that the fighter bombers were laying napalm and heavy bombs almost on top of his own perimeter, building a ring of fire to keep the team from being overrun while the extraction helicopters fought their way in. The helicopters got them out, and then the worst of it happened in the air. The aircraft carrying Zhabatoski and Glover and several of the Nungs was hit, lost power, and went down hard. Zhabatoski was thrown clear, something like 20 feet from the wreck, his clothes on fire, his back broken and several ribs with it, though he did not yet know the extent of it. He could see the helicopter burning with men still inside. He went back into it. With a broken back, he pulled the pilot free, then turned and went for the rest, working through fire and the threat of the fuel and ammunition going up around him until another man dragged the last of them clear. Glover, 3 of the Nungs, and the 2 door gunners died. The co-pilot died later in the hospital. Zhabatoski spent 6 weeks recovering in Pleiku. The team and the air crews were credited with killing several hundred North Vietnamese soldiers in the fight, a figure that, like most counts made in the chaos of contact, should be read as a wartime estimate rather than a settled tally. President Nixon presented Zhabatoski the Medal of Honor at the White House in March of 1969. Years later, he told another Special Forces soldier that he did not consider himself a hero, that he wore the medal for everyone he had served with. The same lethal math caught up with another small team in the daylight version of the same nightmare. And it is worth telling because it shows that the danger was never only about the dark. On the 2nd of May, 1968, a 12-man Special Forces reconnaissance team, 3 Americans and 9 indigenous soldiers, was inserted into dense jungle west of Loc Ninh near the Cambodian border. This was not a SOG cross-border team, but an element of Detachment B-56, a sister reconnaissance effort working the same kind of denied ground. Within a short time, the team had landed almost on top of a North Vietnamese force estimated at around 1,000 men, and the calls for emergency extraction turned desperate as 3 helicopters were driven off by small arms and anti-aircraft fire. Staff Sergeant Roy Benavidez was at the forward operating base, listening to it on the radio. He could not stand to hear it. He jumped aboard the next rescue ship carrying a medical bag and a knife. And when it could not land, he leapt from the hovering aircraft and ran roughly 75 meters through fire to reach the trapped men, taking wounds to his leg, face, and head before he even got there. What followed was 6 hours of it. He repositioned the survivors, directed their fire, dragged the wounded and the dead toward the helicopters, pulled classified documents from the hands of the dead team leader, took a bayonet wound and clubbing and hand-to-hand fighting, and kept going until every man, living and dead, was aboard. By the end, he had 37 separate wounds from bullets, shrapnel, and the bayonet. At the evacuation point, a doctor took him for dead and began to zip him into a body bag, and Benavidez, unable to speak, spat in the man's face to prove he was alive. He was given the Distinguished Service Cross. The full account stayed buried for years until a surviving witness came forward, and it was not until 1981 that President Reagan upgraded the award to the Medal of Honor. Robert Howard's night came at the end of that same year, on the 30th of December, 1968, in Cambodia. Howard was a sergeant first class, by the recollection of the man who served with him, the most physically imposing and hardest soldier in the recon company at Command and Control Central. On that day, he was second in command of a platoon-sized hatchet force gone into Cambodia on a recovery mission, hunting for an American named Robert Sheridan who had gone missing across the fence. The kind of assignment SOG called a bright light, and the deadliest of all, because the enemy knew the Americans would come back for their own and would set the ground accordingly. The force was hit by a far larger enemy element. A blast destroyed Howard's weapon and tore into his hands, and he could not walk. He crawled through the fire to his wounded platoon leader, lying exposed, pulled him to cover, and gave first aid, then organized what was left of the men into a perimeter and held it through hours of fighting until the helicopters could reach them. He was nominated for the Medal of Honor 3 times across 13 months for 3 separate actions. The first 2 nominations were knocked down to a Silver Star and a Distinguished Service Cross because the actions had taken place on ground the United States would not admit it was fighting on, and acknowledging the valor would have meant acknowledging the place. President Nixon presented him the Medal of Honor on the 2nd of March, 1971. He is remembered as one of the most decorated American soldiers of the war. These were not the only nights the secret war turned on, and the record keeps a fuller accounting than the legend does. The same counter-recon machine that lost men to Python's Claymores also tore teams apart. When Recon Team Intruder went down in the A Shao, a helicopter knocked out of the sky by anti-aircraft fire, one survivor, Sammy Hernandez, came on the ground and lay listening to North Vietnamese soldiers and trackers moving through the dark hunting the team. He crawled into the thickest vegetation he could find and stayed silent through the entire night, because silence was the only weapon he had left. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the